Good afternoon, everyone, and on behalf of the Friends of the Village Library of Cooperstown, welcome to the second of the Sunday Speaker Series for 2020-2021 with SUNY Oneonta professors Howard Ashford and George Hovis, and a discussion of the award-winning novel, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. My name is Leanne Hirabayashi, and I'll be co-moderating the session with Martha Membrino, and thank you all for joining us. Let me go over a few items related to logistics and format for this session. There will be a couple brief messages from the host and sponsor, after which I'll introduce our speakers and they will make their presentation. Then we'll have a question and answer session, which will be handled by my co-moderator, Martha Membrino, for attendees. And it looks like we're up to about 25 participants so far. So for attendees, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see several icons in this bar, similar to what I'm showing here. Please note that chat is disabled and we're not going to be using the raise hand feature, just the Q&A tool. If you have a question, just click on that Q&A icon and send it in. Martha will be monitoring the Q&A tool and she'll be asking questions on your behalf. We may not be able to get to everyone's questions, and we appreciate your understanding on that. Finally, the programs in this Sunday Speaker Series are being recorded, and a link to each recording will be made available on the Friends of the Village Library webpage. And now just a brief message from the Friends of the Village Library, which works closely with the library to sponsor educational and entertaining programs for the community. This annual Sunday Speaker Series is one way the group fulfills its mission by hosting a slate of monthly programs, usually scheduled from October through May. And each year the series features a diverse group of speakers on topics that have included local history and geology, climate change, healthcare, and discussions with local artists, authors, and journalists on the issues of the day. Today's program features, as I said earlier, a discussion of the novel The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, winner of the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the 2016 National Book Award for Fiction. And as I said, this will be led by Dr. George Hovis, Professor of English, and Dr. E. Howard Ashford, Assistant Professor of Africana and Latinx Studies, both at SUNY Oneonta. The League of Women Voters of the Cooperstown area is grateful for this opportunity to sponsor the Friends of the Village Library's Sunday Speaker Series with its goal of providing educational programming to the community. Serving the people of the Cooperstown area, which is the village of Cooperstown, the towns of Otsego, Middlefield, Springfield, and Hartwick, and surrounding towns in northern Otsego County, we are a nonpartisan political organization. The League of Women Voters encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy through education and advocacy. And to find out more, please go to our website, lwvcooperstownarea.org. And again, thank you so much for this great voter turnout this past election. So now let's move on to today's program. I'll start first by introducing George Hovis, who is a professor of English at SUNY Oneonta, where he teaches courses in creative writing and American literature. He's the author of a novel, The Skin Artist, published in 2019, as well as a book of literary criticism, Veil of Humility, Plain Folk and Contemporary North Carolina Fiction, published in 2007. George earned his PhD in English from the University of North Carolina in 2001. His short stories and essays have appeared widely in journals and essay collections. In addition to awards for his writing, he has been recognized with the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Evan Edward Ashford is an assistant professor in the Africana and Latinx Studies Department at SUNY Oneonta. He holds a bachelor's degree in accounting, master's degrees in public policy and administration history and African American studies. His current research focuses on late 19th century rural Black liberation politics and its role in shaping 20th century Southern Jim Crow society. Welcome, both of you. Oops, and let me go ahead and stop my share. And now we will go ahead and I'm going to pass it over to George and Howard. Gentlemen, please take it away.
Thank you, Leanne. I believe I won the coin toss to go first, so here I go. Thanks, first of all, to Leanne and Martha for coordinating this and inviting me to participate, and thank you, Howard, for agreeing to join me in this discussion. I'm delighted and honored to be here with all of you. I thought I would start out by offering some remarks about the literary traditions of the neo-slave narrative and the slave narrative. So I have prepared a few slides. I'll go ahead and share if I can do that. Okay. Can you all see that screen? Let me see if I can enhance it a bit. Is that visible to everyone? I hope so. All right. Well, so Colson Whitehead's 2016 novel, The Underground Railroad, is an example of a neo-slave narrative. And by that, we mean a fictional account of slavery. And it's part of a burgeoning tradition that started to proliferate very powerfully in the 1970s and 80s. Probably you recognize some of these titles. When we consider them together, you know, they have certain hallmarks that are part of the legacy of the tradition of the slave narrative. So they share with their predecessors a desire to tell the truth about the horrors of slavery, but also to address the horrors and the exigencies of our current time. You know, another feature that many slave narratives have in common is fantastical elements. In this novel, if you've read it, you discover sort of about a third of the way through that the Underground Railroad in Colson Whitehead's novel is literally an underground railroad. He takes the metaphor and makes it literal. You know, in Beloved, you have a ghost story, a haunting. In Oxherding Tale, you have shapeshifters. In Flight to Canada, we have an alternate rendering of history. In Octavia Butler's Kindred, we have time travel. So elements of the fantastic are a common element to neo-slave narratives. And if you like fantastical literature, chances are you'll be drawn to this genre. But I want to talk more about the tradition of the slave narrative. Consensus among scholars of African-American literature holds that the African-American literary tradition begins with the slave narrative, and particularly with the antebellum narrative of escape from slavery. All of those antebellum slave narratives shared a common rhetorical purpose of showing to the world the horrors of slavery. In the same way that people the world over were horrified in the 1960s by images of children in Birmingham being blasted with fire hoses, people being attacked by German shepherds and bludgeoned and tear gassed in Alabama when they try to walk across a bridge. In the same way that we now are horrified when we see cell phone footage of George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, the list goes on. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, people in America and abroad were horrified by the accounts of slavery they read in the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Moses Roper, Moses Grandy, and many more. And just as today we see busted and broken are myths about police officers just doing their jobs and fighting crime and criminals, and the same can be said for district's attorney and prosecutors. You know, back then we had our myths busted about happy slaves and paternal masters. Those myths were debunked by the various authors of slave narratives, in which they detailed accounts of vicious brutality and cold, calculating economics. So that's the main purpose of the slave narrative, truth telling. And one of the main elements of that truth telling is to provide a portrait of the enslaved person as fully human, to map out the regions of their interior life, and to do so in their own words. And considering the great possibilities of the novel, the great strength of the novel, in my opinion, is to map out the interior life of an individual. Then it follows that this tradition of the slave narrative would inform contemporary novels about slavery. One of the main features of antebellum slave narratives were the words written by himself. We see here on the frontispiece of Douglas's 1845 narrative, the first of three of his autobiographies, the words written by himself. So it was very important to the reading public to see the intellectual life, the rich interior world of the slave, to debunk the common myth of the time that enslaved people were less than fully human. One of the truths about the antebellum slave narrative is that the vast majority of them, almost all of them, were penned by men. And so it's worth considering what we learn when we do have a slave narrative written by a woman. And the most famous example is Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, in which she's writing under the pen name of Linda Brent. And one of the things that Jacobs is able to achieve in her story is to show the special horrors that slavery had for women slaves. The enslaved woman, and it's typified in Jacobs' account, has sexual assault and rape added to the list of other horrors. And in mapping out that interior life of her own experience, she shows not just the physical horrors, but the psychological horrors as well. I think it's worth noting another feature of the antebellum slave narrative, which shows up in Colson Whitehead's novel and in the neo-slave narrative more generally, and that is the agency of the enslaved person to resist oppression. In Frederick Douglass's narrative, there's a turning point where he fights back against Edward Covey, who is a small farmer to whom he has been leased out for the year. And they have this knockdown, drag out fight. And surprisingly, he is not reported to the authorities because Edward Covey enjoys this special reputation as a slave breaker, and he's afraid to ruin that reputation. And that moment of fighting back is a turning point in the narrative that prompts Douglass to remark, "You've seen how a man was made a slave, now you will see how a slave is made a man." So that feature of resistance and agency is prominent in Douglass's narrative, and it's prominent in Harriet Jacobs as well, where she resists sexual assault at the hands of Dr. James Norcom. And I think we see in the character of Cora, the protagonist of Whitehead's novel, that same kind of resistance and agency that you find in the antebellum slave narrative, specifically in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Another feature of Jacobs' memoir that shows up in Underground Railroad is her being cloistered in an attic. Jacob spent 7 years in a tiny space, in a kind of very tiny space in the attic of her grandmother's home in the very town of Edenton, North Carolina, where she had been enslaved, while her owner was looking for her. And if you've read Underground Railroad, you will see echoes to that episode in Jacob's novel there when Cora is in North Carolina and is hiding out. So I want to talk a little bit about the postbellum slave narrative. I've said that the antebellum slave narrative is the primary inspiration for, I would say, most of the neo-slave narrative, certainly for Underground Railroad. But what of the post-emancipation slave narrative? The most famous of which is Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, published in 1901. There are many more slave narratives from the post-emancipation period, especially those that were recorded by the Works Progress Administration during the 1930s. But the example, or the one that was most widely read and most influential, was this 1901 publication. It's a very different account of slavery than the accounts we get from from Jacobs and Douglas and other antebellum authors, in that it has a very different rhetorical purpose. Whereas those antebellum slave narratives had the single-minded purpose of showing the horrors of slavery to the world, of creating outrage, for the sole purpose of stoking the fires of abolitionism. And the post-emancipation period, it's a much milder portrait of slavery that we get, because the rhetorical purpose is different. The needs of the time are different. Booker T. Washington consistently reminds his reader that he does not blame white people for the traumas of slavery, that it was the system that unfortunately the nation had grafted upon itself that was to blame. It wasn't any individual or any particular race. And, you know, Washington has taken a lot of heat for that position, but if we consider that he's writing it after the collapse of Reconstruction, during a period of widespread lynchings and terror and the possibility of genocide, I think we can understand the ways and the whys that he appeases a white readership. At the same time that he is trying to inspire a Black readership to persevere and to seek success in adverse circumstances. And even though, you know, Washington, I don't think is much of an inspiration on the novel that we're considering today, the lines or the refrain from Underground Railroad that we get about who built this country, who built everything in this country, I think we get from the evidence of hard work that we see in Up from Slavery, the sort of unacknowledged labor of Black people to build America. You know, we see in Washington's narrative as well as in this novel. So that's a little bit about the slave narrative as a literary tradition that precedes or anticipates and inspires the novel that we're discussing today. I can say more about that and more about the history. I will end with the thought that you know, any particular text, it sees its stock go up and down. Washington's Up from Slavery was the main you know, African-American text of the early 20th century. In the 1960s, especially in the later 60s with the rise of Black power, that stock takes a nosedive. It was only really in the 80s through Houston Baker and other scholars who've sort of rehabilitated Washington and said, well, look, you know, these are the realities in the early 20th century that he's responding to. And I would say, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, uh, Douglas sees a reemergence, and Jacobs is, who had sort of almost disappeared, sees a resurgence as a result of Black Power and also of the women's movement. And those are two works that are canonical today, and I think that we can especially see as inspirations to this novel as well as other neo-slave narratives. So that's a little bit about the slave narrative as a literary tradition that anticipates the neo-slave narrative. And I will pass it on to my distinguished colleague, Howard Ashford now.
Greetings, everyone. George, that was a great kind of overview. That's like history and what is being spoken of to those works of literature. What people often don't see is that the stories are the ones that you read first, and then we go back and write the history later. So that's what literature is actually what is happening right then and there. That's at the time. So to understand who the people are, it is important to know what are their experiences in their own words and lenses. What I'll talk about is my reaction to this novel, to this work. As a historian, I tried to read it purely as a story in itself, but the history aspect of me would not let that go. So with the novel, to me, gave me mixed feelings. I didn't know how I felt about trying to go back and write of an experience that is already known, but then to try to add things to it that takes away from the actual experience itself. I did feel that the book does a lot of good things, but at the same time, it can cause a little bit of problems if you're trying to teach historically. So I'll start off with the good. One thing that I loved about this novel was that it took you away from your more traditional kind of like understanding of this construction that's of a railroad itself, meaning that we typically study this period through the lens of one person. And that is Harriet Tubman. And we get this kind of one way of looking at it, like this is one individual, this is her story, she's strong, she has the will to get out of slavery, she comes back, everyone who's with her is saved and they get their freedom. And that's kind of the one kind of storyline that we get. And I love the fact that he takes you away from that to show the doubt, to show the fear, to show that everyone is not successful in their journey. And I think that it's important to kind of show that there's a spectrum that's of experience and not just one one story. So I did like that. I did like that he created people that were far more complex. That resistance isn't just about being strong. That no, resistance is actually to see what is the world that's like what you're living in, and to know that not everyone is resisting all at one time, because if they did, history will look a lot different. So it takes people to go through what they have to go through, and to when they reach their breaking point is when they choose to run or leave. So I do appreciate that aspect of it. I like the hidden meanings of the book as well. I like the fact that in the end, that there is no freedom. that I like in the end that you start with Cora, and this is her journey, and you would think after all that she has gone through, in the end, like ironically, she will end up in a state, Missouri, which is historically significant because of Dred Scott case. And that was the case that said, whether no Black people, you will never be free in this country, meaning that no, you will never be seen as a human being. You will never be seen that's as equal to white people. So it kind of ends on, she has this journey to be free, but she ends in the state that kind of decides Black people's fate, at least in that time period. Or you can kind of say, well, that's happening today, is that where is the equality at? Are Black people viewed as human entities, human beings, or are they still seen that's as objects? So I did like the fact that he has you think, but you, at the same time, you kind of have to know history to get this novel. I think if you just kind of start with the novel, it's a head scratcher. And that led to my more so, I'll say critique, because again, which I don't write literature, I study what was written as how it's linked to history. So I don't want to critique the style and, and things like that, because that's not what I study. But the reality of when you're going to try to do something new to a narrative, it's important to stay as true to the actual experience. And if you're on a journey to freedom, you don't stop in different places along the way and let's stop in Charleston, South Carolina, or I think I'll like it here. And this is what is going on here. I felt that part was, this is what's happening in these different states, and Black people here have this experience. But if you're Black and free, you have this experience. Then I felt that part jumped the shark, as they say now. It jumped ship from where it was like, I like what you're trying to do, but now it's becoming a little bit hard as a historian to take this aspect of the book as true experience, because you did not stop in the South. That your journey was to get to the North, not to go and look at the sites of the South. And the idea that it is a literal kind of train and railroad, it takes away from the fact that it's not just one direction, that people went east, they went west, they went south to Cuba and Haiti, especially as times change and as the laws change to where you can escape to anywhere. That's like in the States, that you could be returned to slavery. So you're not trying to just run, quote unquote, to the North, you're trying to run anywhere that you can to get freedom. So this kind of train that just goes in one direction kind of thing, or where it's not really known, and that you kind of know it from Georgia to South Carolina to North Carolina. Then after that in Indiana, kind of no one knows. This idea was well thought. It was well planned. And I think that at times he treats it a little bit not as historically as it was. But again, I see what he's trying to do. So I was mixed. I like the idea, but the historian aspect of me is like, how would I teach this to my students? Because it would give two completely kind of different messages. So I don't want to eat too much into the discussion, but that was my overview, is that if you're going to write about history, it needs to stay as close to what actually happened. Because when you start to add in your own spin, it takes it into what he wanted it to be as opposed to what it actually was.
If I might interject there, I think, what you're saying is right to the heart of the reading experience of this novel. If you kind of do have to bring some knowledge of history to it, or if you think, oh, I'm going to get a history lesson, well, you are, but you might be confused. I mean, the fact that her first stop is in South Carolina, after leaving Georgia. I mean, the place the novel begins in this plantation in Georgia is sort of this recognizable horrors of slavery. If you've read those antebellum slave narratives, you seem to be on familiar terrain. But once she hops on board that Underground Railroad and pops out in South Carolina, this does not look like a South Carolina that ever existed. Anybody who knows anything about South Carolina knows it is the farthest thing from a modern progressive state, right? I mean, you just name some politicians from Calhoun to Strom Thurmond to Lindsey Graham, and South Carolina is not a modern progressive state. But in the novel, it represents an idea of sort of a modern, United States where you're free now, or you're property of the United States government, but you're free now. And so yeah, it kind of takes history and like the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee, or the long history of eugenics that factors in, but it mixes it all around, and it's not in any way a straightforward treatment of history. I would say that that's part of the fun of reading the book, but yes, potentially confusing.
And I will agree with that in terms of what it's trying to portray. I think choosing a state like that to say that this is what things could look like in the South, I kept trying to think historically, what is he trying to pull from? And the best thing I can get was the two sisters who were anti-slavery, Angelica Grimke, her sister. I think that's their state. So
Yeah.
I think this kind of idea that there are white people in this state who are not for this institution of slavery. That's kind of the thing that I could draw on, but you have to take some classes to know who are the Grimke sisters and what did they stand for and why this location. But I did like the idea, or I did like how he did to say, no, to be free is one thing, but that doesn't mean that you are truly free, because if the idea is to stop those who are free from having children because you're a threat now, because the more people that are born who are free, it will throw off those who are not free. So part of what keeps the structure going are Black women that are not free, because those who have children, their children are born that's like a slave. So you're trying to stop people that are free from like having children, because if you are born and your mother is free, you're free. So I like the idea that he's playing with a larger kind of view of history itself. It's that's of the institution itself, and why it grew was because your status is through the woman, the mother, and therefore, you have to be controlled, even though quote unquote you're free. So it's things like that I think are great. I just think if he had thrown in a historical that like reference here and there, it would have tied it together, as opposed to just reading like a lot of things happening, but not happening without reason.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all mixed together. I mean, the fugitive slave law of 1850 is is referenced in the South Carolina section, and throughout the novel, but it's all sort of mixed together in fun ways.
Ridgway, I think he's that whole law. Ridgway is that law. I mean, his constant pursuit, his desire. I think he comes to be, I'm going to hunt you down. I'm going to bring you back. Because that's kind of the kind of role that he takes, is that he's the law that's going to kind of stop people from trying to run and escape. So I like that one person, to me, to me, it read like that he spoke to what the laws were at the time, but the law now just has like a human entity to it.
Yeah, yeah. And the fear that they feel of him as almost this supernatural entity, it feels very realized.
May I interrupt here for 1 second?
Yes.
And remind our participants that we're welcome to pass along your questions to George and Howard. The Q&A button at the bottom is the only one that's actually activated right now. So if you have questions,
actually.
Pardon?
Hands have gone up, actually.
Hands have gone up. We can't.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we'll have to do is submit a question in
They're
the
still
Q&A
raising their
section.
hand, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see hands being raised, but that function is not activated. Which is
So it's the Q&A button that we need to press. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned talking about historical accounts of slaves in the 1930s through the WPA program. Were there any written accounts by slave catchers? Do we ever see any accounts?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Yeah. Colson Whitehead was asked that question at one point, and his response was that that's not what he looked into. So I just wondered, if either of you had heard of such.
I would, what I've read about slave catchers and the sort of sketches of them in slave narratives you see, they're not highly literate people. They're pretty rough,
right?
Sort of
They're
element. They're probably not going to be, I don't know, writing too many books, but
yeah.
Ridgway, I think, departs from the historical figure in that sense that he's kind of this philosophical, this diabolical character, but also philosophical and well-spoken. And I don't think that was the typical slave catcher.
Yes, I agree. These are people who are hired out. So these are people that don't have as much means, probably do not know how to read or write, and then also did like anyone, I think that's like ever stopped to ask them like, what was your experience? Or I want to know like what your experience. I think it was just norm to go out and do this, not necessarily because it's for a cause that you want others to know about. I think the best indication you have, I think, would be kind of like the flyers to actually show who you're looking for. I think in the book, I think that like each chapter starts that way. That may be the lens of the catcher itself that you get, is that it's all about one goal, not necessarily what they are kind of going through and experiencing. But yes, that's not a question that gets asked because I don't really think anyone has thought to look into it.
There is one question, Ashley, it didn't all come through. If you wanted to, you have a partial question here. There it is. Oh, okay, thank you. All right. George, you and I have talked about the purpose of fiction today and Zadie Smith's article in Defense of Fiction. I think there is something in the way this novel is written that is confronting the purpose of fiction. What is the purpose of things that are untrue?
The purpose of things that are untrue?
In exposing truths.
Right.
The question is,
well,
can you address that? Yeah.
Howard takes objection to the historical liberties that Colson Whitehead has taken. Those don't bother me so much. I'm not a historian, except in support of a good story. So yeah, I think there's a poetic truth. I think for me, the question is, in what ways does this novel speak to our current moment? Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to hear what Howard might say to that question. What are your thoughts, Howard, about how this novel this historical novel feels relevant to today?
I think for me, the ending kind of spoke more to what's happening today, is that no matter where you go, there's going to be struggle. There's no such place as freedom, meaning that it wasn't constructed that way for Black people and other groups that are non-white, or groups that have not been expanded into what we now think of as white today. I think it more spoke to this concept of either you learn to live with it or you leave altogether. But anywhere you go, there's no such place as, or there's no such thing as 100% kind of like you're accepted, you're equal. No, this is a land for you and I. I think I think that what the novel is saying is that despite history, you know, people are going to live the truth that they have in their own mind. And unfortunately, the group that doesn't have the voice, or in terms of power, your experience is not necessarily going to be heard. It's not that important. And I think that, you know, kind of what you're seeing today is you're seeing one group trying to say, we matter, our voice matters. And then every time you speak, here comes another group trying to squash it, to say it doesn't matter because this is our nation and you're here. So either live in what you have, or I'll say leave altogether. But I think that that's why the train never actually goes into any area that's free, to say that Black people don't want to leave. We just want to be equal. We just want to be free. But I think what the book does show is these two kind of two ways of looking at society, and that the two will never really come together. It's going to be one, or the idea that one has to be seen and the other, it cannot be heard or seen or heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is, you know, the ending of the novel, she does come out of the tunnel into the light, and she does sort of travel west toward the hope of freedom. But based on the sort of recurrent pattern of out of the frying pan into the fire that this episodic novel gives us, we're reluctant to hope too deeply. You know, we gotta hope. And I think that's true to the history of you know, African Americans in this country, is that you have to hope, but be prepared for another round of oppression. Does that make sense?
Well, one of the things that I was going to ask about, that sense of optimism in, you know, can we take some optimistic feelings from after reading the book? It's some of the passages are just devastating, but Whitehead is quoted as saying that he finds the last pages very hopeful, but he said, but still, wherever we go, we're still in America, which is an imperfect place. That's the reality of things. Yeah. And that was his response to an interviewer's question about optimism.
Go ahead, George.
Well, you know, if you look at the African American literary tradition, there's a lot of tragedy, and there are many stories that don't end with this sort of requisite happy ending. No. So I think what this novel offers is about as good as it gets, that there is some hope, but it doesn't let the reader off the hook. it doesn't let the reader think, oh, well, we're done with that. We saw, and I think that's true to our history. I think that's one of the problems with our narratives of history in this country, is to say, well, we ended slavery, we're done, or we had the civil rights movement, we fixed that, and we elected a black president, so look, we're living in post-racist America. And I think in the last 4 years we have discovered very demonstrably we do not live in post-racist America. We have not solved the problems. And the Black Lives Matter movement has shown us there is much work to be done. For every 2 steps forward, there's about 1 and 9/10 step back. I don't know, it's this constantly recursive process. And so to my mind, it makes sense that the history of in the novel, it's not this sort of linear progression that we think we know. It's all mixed up, and I think that is true to our history.
There is a question that's come in. This conversation makes me wonder about the history of African Americans leaving to found, is that Liberia? Or is
Liberia?
That like Liberia, okay, in Africa, for example. And also the differences between the experience of Black Africans versus Black Americans, such as, and I don't know how to pronounce this, I apologize, Adichie, Adiche, talks about in Americana. Thoughts?
I'm teaching that novel right now, actually, Americana, and in my view, that novel shows the race as a factor, but also national experience as a factor. It's in some ways an autobiographical novel, and Adichie comes from Nigeria, immigrates to America, and she discovers race for the first time, to show that, to sort of historically contextualize the experience of race. I'm not sure I handled that question very well. Howard, maybe you have thoughts to add.
Well, the experiments of trying to relocate Black Americans back to Liberia did not go well, because what ends up happening is that Black Americans bring their understanding of race to an area that did not have race, and they begin to try to implement what they think how these individuals should act. So again, you're born into a system, and that over time you will come to try to, you'll act within what you only know. So when Black Americans go back to Africa, what they only know is this idea of how, of a constructed society, which they try to take back to then say, you're heathens, you should act like this, you should speak like this. And the experience is not what people thought it would be, because you assume just because this is your homeland, although we talk about a big space of land, that you just that you assume just by dropping people in the middle of a continent that they're going to have some type of link to it, and they don't. They have a link to what they know. Therefore, it's a dual experience, is that they do not know how to be African because they're just American. Therefore, that's why a lot of Black people did not want to leave, because where am I going to go? It's not like you have my name to say this is the tribe that I came from in this area. It's like you just can't drop me in the middle of a big landmass and say, good luck. So like in regards to the experience, that's what you're saying, is that you have people who are coming into a locale or into into a country where it's no longer about you, the individual, it's about your skin color. Therefore, if you only kind of know yourself as one thing, Nigerian, and then you come over and now you're Black, well, what does that mean? Or if you only know yourself as Black, but then now you get to express yourself by your tribe, by your language, what does that mean? So I think the two experiences don't really come together, because literally now you really have two groups of people, distinct groups of people. Even though they come from a common area, their experiences are going to be completely different. Therefore, Blacks in America are really a new people, because they've been dispersed for so long and there's been little connection back, even though you can see those trends over time. But to go back to say, I'm Kenyan, I'm Nigerian, most Black people have no connection to it and don't want it either, because they see themselves as being born in this country. This is their home base.
We have no open questions at the moment. So if you wanted to go on and just talk about some of the other.
I wanted to go back to your question about hope and optimism.
Mm-hmm.
The end, well, this novel's, or kind of how it ends, reminds me more of the Street by Ann Petrie. The street in which in the novel is dark and gloomy, but yet she has hope and aspiration that there is this idea that Black people can live in America and live the dream of being able to go up and above what is expected of you. And she has a son that she's trying to mold into thinking, this is the American dream. You can live this life. And in the end, it does not work out for her, but she still holds hope that even though it didn't work for her, that it can work for the next person. So there's hope as a window. And I guess and it read like, everyone, you have your window of hope. It's when you take it, it's how you take it. And to try and keep it open, even though it doesn't work for you, it may work for the next person. But in reality, though, I get Richard Wright's Native Son, in that no matter where you go, you are surrounded, and there's, and no matter how hard you try, every day is a reminder that you are Black. And no matter what that has done to make you act the way that you act, society will never come to acknowledge its past doings, and that you're just there. So I think that the novel does try to end on hope, but I think it kind of overlooks this era of Black writings from Wright, Fella Ellison's Invisible Man, kind of thing, where in the end, there's really not much but darkness. So I like the fact that there is hope and change on the horizon, but for many, it's just, for many, like Lovey, it's just going to end badly for you. Like Bigger Thomas, kind of thing. So I could, it just, but it does show a spectrum, I think, a Black experience as well. So not everyone is put into just one box.
It is worth noting just how much suffering and death there is in this novel. And it makes it hard to hope. Although I agree that at the end of the novel, you have to keep hoping.
We have one more question here.
Okay.
Hope exists in the math that likely shifts within the next 20 years. When will both history and literary works begin to see the potential power in numbers?
Howard, do you have a response to that?
I'm thinking, so I was going to throw it to you.
I assume we're talking about math in terms of the population shift, the demographics.
Yeah.
Am I reading that right? Or interpreting that correctly?
Well, it's interesting. Down in my native state of North Carolina, I thought had addressed some of the gerrymandering that had been done, but it didn't seem to impact the results of this election too much. So I'm no political scientist, nor am I a statistician. So I don't really, I'm not sure what, in terms of literature, literature moves slowly, I think. Literature is backward looking by its very nature, whether you're talking about historical fiction or not. So yeah, it might be a while before. Mm-hmm. And that assumes that we're looking towards some utopian future. I have more of an apocalyptic vision, I must confess. So I'm not too hopeful for that utopia, but maybe Howard is.
Well, I tend to be more optimistic in nature, which you have to be. Sometimes, if not, you'll you won't make it. But I think that the opportunity exists for people to write about what's happening now and to mix history with literature. If you look at Black Lives Matter, what novel has been written to show this is what happens when you have the people who are coming out, even though it's not about necessarily them per se, but yet they're coming out to help another group get their voice. That's numbers. But yet it's not yet you could take in history and you can mix in storytelling and literature to create a work to show this is where things can go. If you look at Georgia, that was that's a novel right there that has not been written, that should be which just happened, but that should be written now. That's like 2008 was 2008. That's another example of to see that with numbers can defeat. It's like a mindset. The question is, do people want to write that? And then two, is that what sells? Because at the end of the day, a book is only as good as it gets released and what kind of attention does it get. And I've come to learn in my research that what makes money is not good news. So if you're writing about slavery and the struggles and the victimization and the oppression, that gets published. I write the flip side of that. What are the efforts that Black people are doing to become truly free? And what is the response to that to show us kind of where we are today in terms of this kind of overall struggle? No one wants to hear that because if Black people are in a position to defeat the oppressor, many folks are out of a job, because if you stake your career on oppression, and that's what is being sold, and that's what people think that a group is, then those works will only be the ones that get written over and over and over again, which was kind of my somewhat smaller critique of this book, was that he didn't show those who did make it and their lives, and to show Cora as reaching for this ideal. It was just existing as opposed to like an ideal where it is I want to get to. So I think that there's strength in math. I think that it's out there. I think people may be hesitant to write it because they feel that it won't get picked up and published.
Leanne, I think we have finished with our Q&A and our very interesting conversation. Thank you. I'll turn it back to you.
Well, that was just a terrific program. Thank you, Howard, George, and Martha. Yeah, that was, I could have gone on for quite a bit longer. So thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen just for a moment to give you a quick reminder of about what's coming up in the next month or two. So let me just bring that up. Okay. So on Sunday, December 6th, so the next Sunday speaker series will be up, and that's from antebellum to anti-racism, redirecting your down south tourism. That'll be Sydney Waller. Join us for a conversation with gallerist Sydney Waller, founder and director of the Art Garage, as well as art critic Holland Cotter, who's the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winner, as they offer a sampler of powerful civil rights sites, destinations for a pilgrimage through living American history, a social justice imperative via art and design. Then mark your calendars for Sunday, January 17, when the Sunday Speaker Series will host Tim Johnson, who is CEO of Otsego Electric Cooperative Incorporated. He'll be speaking on the struggle to establish broadband for rural America. The Sunday Speakers programs are scheduled for 3 p.m. via Zoom. And then also in January, we will be the panel discussion series, Looking in the Mirror, Cooperstown Reflects on Racism, returns with sessions on law enforcement, arts and monuments, housing, politics, and then a wrap-up session on taking action. The Sunday Speaker and Looking in the Mirror series are free and open to the public, and participants may register for the programs by going online at fovl.eventbrite.com. And if you have any questions or comments, please email fovlfriends22main@gmail.com. So I'll go ahead and stop my share. And thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you next month on December 6th. So bye, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.